Hi, Michelle Glass here. Welcome to our second half of Chapter 10. We are here talking about how the muscle cells produce ATP, and what we see is that there is a different type of ATP production depending on whether that muscle is at rest or in its moderate level of activity or at its peak level of activity. Now, resting muscle is building tension without producing any movements. So this is like that muscle tone, that background level of stimulation. Moderate level, then you're doing contraction, you're building tension, and you're producing some movements. So this might be just the muscles involved in speaking or writing or walking. If we're thinking about this in terms of exercise, I define moderate level as working but still being able to carry on a conversation. So it's definitely aerobic. Your peak level of activity is where you are working that muscle to the maximum. So you are building tension and you are sustaining that tension at its maximum level for as long as possible, which is usually fairly short depending on how you've trained that muscle, because with peak level of activity, we will see that the muscle will fatigue. Okay, thinking about our ATP production, keep in mind that muscle contraction is extremely ATP intensive. A single ATP molecule has to bind to each one of those myosin heads for cross-bridge detachment. So one single thick filament can use 2,500 ATP in a single second. And we're looking at one single thick filament and a whole myofibril. So we're talking about using quite a lot of ATP here. When your muscle fiber is at rest, we're going to see that it has the ability to store extra ATP and this new molecule that we haven't talked about before, which is called creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate can be abbreviated as CP. Essentially, you take ATP and creatine, you're basically phosphorylating that creatine, forming the creatine phosphate, and you get ADP made as well there. When our demand is high, then we can reverse the reaction. So we can take the phosphate off the creatine, add it back to an ADP, giving us ATP, which the cell can use. Resting muscle, remember, is our muscle tone, that background level of neural stimulation. We're going to see at this point that the muscle cell will be burning fatty acids. So that means it's going to take a fatty acid molecule, break it down to 2-carbon acetate, use that at the mitochondria to make ATP. So there's no glycolysis happening here because we're not breaking down glucose. We're breaking down fatty acids. We're going to have extra ATP so we can create creatine phosphate. We can also store any glucose in our polysaccharide glycogen. And because we are breaking down those fatty acids at the mitochondria, we are doing aerobic respiration. So we're taking oxygen from our blood as well. So taking a look here at our resting level of activity, the skeletal muscle cell is going to take fatty acids and oxygen out of the bloodstream, use that at the mitochondria, so that means aerobic respiration, to make ATP. That extra ATP is going to be used to take any glucose that's taken from the bloodstream and convert it to glycogen. So now we're seeing actually 3 things being taken out of the bloodstream: fatty acids, oxygen, and glucose. And then remember, we can create extra kind of stores of ATP in the form of our creatine phosphate molecule. ATP demand is obviously higher when the muscle is doing more contraction. So once we start increasing our activities to moderate level, we've increased our ATP demand. Now in this case, we're going to continue breaking down fatty acids to make ATP. So we're going to convert it to a 2-carbon acetate, take that to the mitochondria, and use that to make ATP. But we're also going to start accessing our glucose reserves, which is glycogen. So we're going to break down glycogen to glucose, and then we're going to do glycolysis, and we're going to make some ATP. We're doing aerobic respiration, obviously 2 sources now. We're breaking down both fatty acids and the pyruvic acid from glycolysis. and there's absolutely no extra ATP being produced here. We are making what we need for our cell at this level of activity. So same kind of picture. We're still doing the same thing we did at rest, meaning we're taking fatty acids and oxygen from the bloodstream. We're sticking that to the mitochondria for aerobic respiration to make ATP. And then we're going to break down glycogen molecule to our glucose, take that glucose through the process of glycolysis, which is going to give us pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid goes to the mitochondria for cellular respiration or aerobic respiration, and we get more ATP being produced. So we need to make extra. Okay, nothing's happening with the creatine phosphate here. So you make those molecules for when ATP demand is super high, so that means peak level of activity. Notice too that you're not getting glucose out of the bloodstream here. You're limited to that glycogen molecule that you created during resting level. And then let's look at what's happening in our peak level of activity. Here our ATP demand is super high. This is the highest. And at this point, we're essentially limited to whatever we have in the cell. So you're limited to your glycogen, which was created during resting level. If you have a lot of myoglobin molecule, that's a protein that can store oxygen, then you might have some oxygen stored here that varies cell to cell. And then you also have your creatine phosphate molecule that you created during your resting level of activity. So we can see some aerobic respiration happening at peak level as long as we've got oxygen stored in the cell. And once that stored oxygen gets used up, then you're done doing aerobic respiration. ATP then is primarily produced through the process of glycolysis. And this is going to lead to the buildup of a lactic acid molecule, which the body has to process. And we'll also see the breakdown of ATP is going to build up hydrogen ion, which is going to lead to muscle fatigue. So peak level of activity is not something that is sustainable over a long period of time. It's those like short energetic bursts, and you need a little bit of time for your cell to recover. Now, of course, with training, you can prolong those bursts a little bit longer than when you first started your exercise routine, but it's not something that can be maintained for hours and hours and hours in the same way that moderate level of activity can be maintained over a long period of time. Okay, so here is our same drawing. Now notice here, we're not able to take anything out of the bloodstream. We are limited to whatever has been stored inside of the cell. So primarily, you're going to think about glycolysis as your method for making ATP. So you're breaking down glycogen to give yourself some glucose. That glucose goes through glycolysis, which produces ATP and also pyruvic acid. Now, in aerobic conditions, you can take pyruvic acid to the mitochondria to make ATP, but if it's anaerobic, no oxygen, then you can't do that. Instead, pyruvic acid gets converted to lactic acid, which diffuses into the bloodstream and is transported to the liver for processing. You also have that store of extra phosphate or extra energy in the form of that creatine phosphate molecule. So you're going to use that to make some more ATP. The hydrolysis, the breakdown of that ATP that's being used by the cell is going to increase your hydrogen ion concentration, which is going to lower your pH. When your pH lowers, then you're going to see muscle fatigue. So you're decreasing the contractility of the muscle. It's harder for the myosin head to bind to the active site on actin. Also, you've reduced your activity of your glycolytic enzyme, so you've slowed down glycolysis. So you're slowing down your cross-bridge formation, you're slowing down your glycolysis, and this is going to contribute to muscle fatigue. Okay. Your muscle has to recover from this peak level of activity. One thing we're going to see happening is the lactic acid is recycled. You have to restore your glycogen and your creatine phosphate reserves, which you can do that at rest. And you have to also do what's called paying off your oxygen debt. So let's look at how lactic acid is recycled. Remember, we sent that to the liver. You also see some recycling of this happening in the muscle cell. So if we can go this way, we can go the other way with this reaction. So your lactic acid can be converted to glucose, which then can be stored in the form of the glycogen molecule. So you can right away start replacing those glycogen reserves. At the liver, the same sort of thing is happening. So liver cells are also converting lactic acid to either pyruvic acid and then glucose, or using that pyruvic acid to make ATP. And of course, this is at that resting level of activity that this store of glycogen is being replaced. We also are going to see what's happening with our oxygen debt. So here we see that you might continue breathing heavily even after your exercise is over, because you need to replace that oxygen that's been used up by that muscle cell. So we're back to looking at our muscle at rest and at recovery. It's getting that oxygen in to use for aerobic respiration, ATP. It's also going to be doing this conversion of lactate to glucose to glycogen. It's going to be building up the creatine phosphate reserves, and it's going to be storing some of that oxygen with the molecule myoglobin. You have several hormones that are involved in your muscle metabolism. We've talked about growth hormone before as it relates to the skeletal system, and we see that it also affects your muscle tissue as well. It's going to increase the synthesis of those contractile proteins. So it's going to help you make more myofibrils, more myosin, more actin, more thin and thick filaments, so you can have a more powerful muscle. Testosterone is an example of an androgen. Androgens such as testosterone will do the same kind of activity. So these are, testosterone is a steroid, so that's why some people are taking anabolic steroids in order to increase their muscle mass, which of course can be dangerous. Thyroxins are hormones produced by the thyroid gland. They can be abbreviated as T3 and T4. They're going to be increasing metabolism in cells kind of throughout the body, but here as we talk about skeletal muscle, we will see the metabolism increased in skeletal muscle cells, both that are resting and active. And then epinephrine is abbreviated with the letter E, and this is going to increase your muscle metabolism. It's going to increase the duration of stimulation and the force of contraction. Epinephrine is also what people refer to as adrenaline. So you know that under severe stress conditions, you might be able to produce a more powerful contraction that you can sustain longer than when not under duress. And one of those reasons is because of this huge increase of epinephrine. Okay, and that's it for now.